meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. In the fall of 1989, I visited the city of Perth on the coast of Western Australia for a couple of weeks. And when I say fall, I mean theirs. It was April. At that time, a new casino had been built near town, and they were hosting a car show, which I dutifully attended. There were quite a few cars there from Australia, Go-Go-mobiles, many old-school utes, as well as various American cars built for Australia in the 40s and 50s. But there were a few cars I had never heard of, a Finlayson, a Lewis, and a Tarrant. Now, Tarrant and Tompson have episodes already on VCH, but what about the other vintage cars from down under? Let's take a look. Australia at the turn of the 20th century was in many ways similar to the USA. They had lots of territory with diverse terrain and climates. Neither had significant road systems, and their populations were mostly along the coasts and waterways. Unsurprisingly, the early cars from the US and down under tended to be rugged, high-wheeled cars to better handle the rather unforgiving land. The first gas car built in Australia was made by Harley Tarrant in Melbourne during the early months of 1897. His story is episode 61 on this channel. But a mere few months afterwards, the Australis began its limited production in Sydney. The father and son team of George W. and George Wood Sr. were both engineers that owned a company making bicycles and decided to try their hand at motor vehicles. In 1895, they built the first motorcycle down under, using an engine that they cast in their factory, but was essentially a copy of the De Dion 5-horsepower single-cylinder. 2 years later, they built a tricar using a similar engine. It was in 1900 that they built their first four-wheeled car using their own engine design. It was still similar to the De Dion and produced 3 horsepower. The engine is the oldest known internal combustion engine built in Australia known to still exist. It can be seen at the Powerhouse Collection in New South Wales. In 1900, the first car built in South Australia hit the road, or rather lack of roads. Vivian Lewis and his partner Tom O'Grady owned a factory where they made bicycles since 1893. They built a gas-powered motorcycle in their factory in Adelaide in 1899, and their car of 1900 used the same 2-horsepower air-cooled engine. The following year, they upgraded to a 5-horsepower single-cylinder and displayed the car at various events in Adelaide. 1902 was important for the Lewis Company as they moved to water-cooled V-twin engines of some 8 horsepower for their own production cars, as well as began to import cars from overseas. The Lewis cars were rugged and could reach speeds of some 20 miles an hour, which was decent for the time. The overall design was settled upon by 1903, and the car was driven all around the coast of South Australia. They did sell some cars, but importing became their primary focus by 1904. 2 years later, they ceased car production as selling De Dions, Talbots, Stars, and Napiers was far more profitable for them. However, they continued making bikes and motorcycles for several more years. The next vintage car we're going to take a look at is... Actually, it's Finlayson, and I'm sure by now you've figured out where they were located. The Finlaysons owned an iron foundry in Devonport West on the north coast of Tasmania. Founded in 1887, the company provided a number of products and services, including engineering and design, farm machinery, sawmills, traction engines, and also built steamships. In 1900, 2 of the Finlayson brothers, Jack and Ken, were now running the factory, and they decided to build a steam car. It had a twin-cylinder engine producing about 6 horsepower, and the boiler was fueled by kerosene. Final drive was by chains. From there, they made 8 gas-powered cars with twin-cylinder 10-horsepower engines, and then finally a city bus. The company ceased production in 1907, but would continue in business through to 1990. Now, Caldwell Vale has quite an interesting story. It was founded in 1907 by brothers Felix and Norman Caldwell in Auburn, a small suburb on the west side of Sydney. Initially, the company was just called Caldwell. They founded the company due to a patent that they jointly filed for and received for a new kind of drive chain for gas-powered vehicles, and it was quite unique. According to the patent, the new system was both four-wheel drive and four-wheel steered. The patent states, quote, "Drive to both front and rear axles is by propeller shafts and bevel gears. Half shafts carry the drive along live axles to open-style steering knuckles," end quote. Essentially, power was applied through a bunch of universal joints to the wheels and axles themselves, connected to the chassis in the middle of the axle instead of on both sides. Thus, to steer, the whole axle rotated, the rear axle turning the opposite way as the front to make the turn tighter. In 1910, they partnered with Henry Vail, and thus the company became known as Caldwell-Vail. The three of them together filed for another patent, this one being improved power steering for heavy motor-driven road vehicles. Apparently, this primitive form of power steering used a series of simple cone clutches to bring power from the drive shafts to the axles being turned, making the process easier on the arms. It worked, but the clutches needed maintenance or repair quite often. The company focused primarily on commercial vehicles, such as tractors, construction vehicles, and heavy trucks, though they did make a few touring cars. Their cars had six-cylinder engines of 30 horsepower and, of course, had four-wheel drive and steering. Unfortunately, the company was sued by a number of customers over the performance guarantee they made for their products, which they lost in 1913. The company went out of business, and the remains of its assets were eventually sold to Purcell Engineering in 1916. After the First World War, quite a few new makes of cars were founded down under, which is a tale for another day. The makes of cars we've talked about today, as well as those made by Harley, Tarrant, and Herbert Tompson, were all out of production by 1914. For Australia auto enthusiasts, it was far cheaper to import cars from Europe or North America than to produce them locally with the resources at hand. But the Aussies gave it a go, and in the process produced some very cool cars. And like Australian cars today, they're very distinct to the land down under. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week.